What stands out most about this Detroit Lions draft class is not just the names, not just the positions, but the type of athletes Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell keep bringing into this building. When you really step back and look at it, this class is filled with players who are not just good football players. They are athletic outliers compared to their own peers. And for a team already built to compete right now, that matters a lot. Let's start with Blake Miller, because honestly, this might be one of the most underrated parts of the entire draft. His RAS score sits at an incredible 9.9, which immediately tells you what kind of athlete the Lions believe they just added. This is not a case of a player skipping tests or leaving questions unanswered. He did everything. Every drill, every measurement, every part of the evaluation process showed the same thing: elite athleticism. He ranks 17th among all tackles tested since 1987, and that is not something you just ignore. What makes this even more interesting is how some people were talking about his ceiling before the draft. There were conversations about whether he was just a safe player with a high floor, but maybe not a superstar ceiling. But when you look at these numbers, that argument gets harder to defend. Why would a player with this level of athletic ability suddenly have a limited ceiling? It does not really add up. Sometimes the issue is not talent, it is development. Coming from Clemson, where the program has not looked as sharp lately, maybe the Lions believe there is even more untapped potential there. It is funny because people often assume the freak athlete is always the obvious one, but even comparing him to someone like Penei Sewell creates an interesting conversation. Sewell had a RAS of 8.99, still excellent of course, but Blake Miller's short area quickness and agility numbers stand out in a different way. That should excite Lions fans because offensive tackle depth and future planning matter more than ever. Then you move to Derek Moore, and while the testing profile is less complete, the story is still familiar. Sometimes these guys choose to let the tape speak for itself instead of chasing sprint times. The Lions clearly trusted what they saw on film. That says a lot. Not every great football player needs the full testing sheet to prove it. One player that keeps getting more interesting the more you look at him is Jimmy Rolder. His HRAS came in at 953, and honestly, if you watched him at Michigan, that should not surprise you at all. He was surrounded by other linebackers who got more national attention for being elite athletes, but Rolder was consistently the guy making plays. Sideline to sideline, covering tight ends, helping in zone, stepping into man coverage, bringing physicality against the run. He just kept showing up. That is why there is real excitement about him potentially becoming more than just depth. Malcolm Rodriguez is currently on a one-year deal, and while Malcolm has been a great story for Detroit, the reality of the NFL is simple. If a younger, faster, more explosive player starts pushing for snaps, the team will make tough decisions. Jimmy Rolder feels like one of those guys who could quietly force that conversation sooner than people expect. Then there is Kendrick Law, and this is one of my favorite developmental players in this entire group. His RAS is 9.6, and if he had just a little more height, that score would be even crazier. His size profile is fascinating because while he is not tall, he is built strong. He has that thicker frame that can translate really well in the NFL. What makes him exciting is the possibility that he becomes much better as a pro than he ever looked in college. Inconsistent quarterback play can completely hide what a receiver really is. In Detroit, with structure, timing, and reliable quarterback play, there is a belief he could become a major contributor. Some people see shades of Amon-Ra St. Brown in how he can operate underneath, while others compare him more to a Khalif Raymond type role. And speaking of Khalif Raymond, with his departure, there is now a real opening for someone to grow into that fourth receiver role, backup slot duties, and special teams impact. Kendrick Law could absolutely be that guy. Maybe not immediately, but after a year learning behind veterans like Greg Dortch, the path is there. Kick returns, punt returns, gadget usage. This coaching staff values that versatility. The Lions also gave special attention to undrafted free agent Eric Hunter, and when this front office spends money on a UDFA, fans should pay attention. He was one of the guys they made sure to bring in, and that says a lot. Coming from Morgan State, he stood out as the guy there, and his testing numbers show real explosiveness and speed. What is especially interesting is where he might fit. At linebacker, Detroit always values special teams contributors. Brad Holmes and Kelvin Shepard love linebackers who can help in multiple phases, and Hunter has the body type of a very big safety while testing like one too. At around 224 pounds, adding just a little more size could make him a legitimate depth option at linebacker. That matters because on the back end of the roster, those are the exact battles that decide camp. Players who have been around for a couple years but have not fully cracked the lineup are vulnerable. If Hunter shows he can contribute immediately on special teams and bring athletic upside, he can absolutely make this interesting. And honestly, that might be the biggest takeaway from this class so far. Detroit is not drafting for survival anymore. They are drafting for competition. They are drafting players who can push veterans, challenge depth charts, and eventually replace expensive contributors before it becomes a problem. This roster is being built with purpose, not desperation. And when you look at the athletic profile of these additions, it becomes very clear the Lions are betting on upside without sacrificing readiness. The question now is simple. Which of these new names do you think has the best chance to surprise everyone and become a real impact player for Detroit this season? And that is where the roster conversation gets really interesting, because once you stop looking only at the draft picks and start looking at the actual 53-man roster projection, you realize just how difficult it is going to be for some of these players to make this team. And honestly, that is a very good problem for the Detroit Lions to have. At running back, there are no major surprises at the top. You still have Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, and that remains one of the best backfields in the entire NFL. Few teams can match that combination of explosiveness and physicality, but once you get past those two, the conversation changes quickly. Suddenly, you are looking at Isaiah Pacheco and Sione Vaki trying to prove they belong in those depth roles, and the feeling becomes very simple. Okay, now it is on you. That is especially true for Vaki. Talent has never been the biggest concern. Availability has been. At some point, staying healthy becomes part of the evaluation. The Lions need reliability, not just flashes. This season feels like a major opportunity for him to prove he can be part of the long-term picture instead of just another what-if story. At wide receiver, the biggest emotional conversation is obviously the move on from Khalif Raymond. Fans loved him. Teammates loved him. His value inside the locker room clearly mattered, and sometimes we as fans never fully see what a player means behind the scenes. But purely from a football standpoint, the Lions seem confident they can replace that production. The top three remain strong, and then the focus shifts to players like Kendrick Law, Dominic Lovett, and Jackson Meeks. This is where having a competent backup quarterback in preseason becomes huge. Last year, one of the best things Detroit had was the ability to actually evaluate young receivers, because the quarterback play allowed it. Whether it was Teddy Bridgewater or Kyle Allen, the point was simple. Someone had to get these young players the ball consistently so the staff could make real decisions. That is what fans should watch closely this preseason. Can Kendrick Law show enough to become that future fourth receiver? Can Dominic Lovett force the coaching staff to keep him? Can Jackson Meeks prove he deserves more than a practice squad role? Those battles are going to be some of the most fun to watch. At tight end, things feel surprisingly stable. Sam Laporta remains the centerpiece, Brock Wright is still firmly in place, and suddenly people realized Brock was not actually leaving like some originally thought. That group feels set. If anything, the lack of movement there says something important. The Lions are clearly confident in Laporta's health and recovery because they did not make a major move at the position. There are a few names like Thomas Gordon and Shane Zylstra type depth conversations that are interesting, but realistically, this room feels locked unless someone completely explodes during camp. The offensive tackle room might be one of the most fascinating position groups on the entire roster. Larry Borom and Giovanni Manu are right in the middle of that conversation, and let's be honest, this is the year where the Manu conversation becomes unavoidable. When Detroit traded significant draft capital to go get him, the vision was obvious. He was supposed to be the future developmental tackle, the athletic monster from Canada who needed time, but could eventually step into a starting role when Taylor Decker's time came to an end. That was the dream. If that worked, it would have looked genius. But right now, the reality feels different. The Lions just spent a first-round pick on a tackle. That tells you everything. It tells you they do not view Manu as the future starter they once hoped for. Maybe he still becomes valuable depth. Maybe he becomes a swing tackle, but the original plan clearly changed. Best case scenario now, Larry Borom becomes the trusted right side backup, while Manu develops enough to become the left side backup behind Penei Sewell and eventually grows into a true swing tackle role. That would still be valuable. But it is hard not to look back and think the original investment should have produced more by now. Inside the offensive line though, things feel much stronger. This might be one of the most encouraging parts of the roster. At guard, Christian Mahogany looks like a real answer. Tate Ratledge adds more stability. Miles Frazier and Ben Barch give Detroit legitimate backup options. That matters because last season the depth concerns were real. If someone went down, fans felt nervous immediately. Now, it feels different. At center, Cade Mays and Juice Scruggs bring more competition and depth, and that is huge. Last year, the center situation behind the starter felt dangerously thin. This year, there are actual options. Juice Scruggs has starting experience. If someone has to step in for a few games, you are not panicking. That is what championship teams look like. It is not just about having stars, it is about surviving injuries without your entire season collapsing, and that is probably the strongest argument for why this Lions team feels different right now. Not only is this one of the best starting offensive lines in football, but the depth behind it is finally starting to look real too. That balance is incredibly hard to build. Even at linebacker, where fans keep debating the final roster spots, the competition is real. Malcolm Rodriguez, Derek Barnes, Jimmy Rolder, and those UDFA names like Eric Hunter all create pressure. Detroit may be moving more toward a base nickel look, which means the third linebacker role matters differently now, but the fight for those spots is still going to be intense. And honestly, that is what should excite every Lions fan. There are fewer free roster spots now. Players have to earn everything. That is how real contenders operate. This is no longer a team hoping to become relevant. This is a team trying to stay at the top of the NFC, and every roster decision reflects that mindset. That is why this offseason feels so important. Brad Holmes is not just collecting talent, he is protecting the future while trying to win right now. And if even 2 or 3 of these young players hit faster than expected, this roster gets even more dangerous. So now I want to hear from you. Do you believe this current Lions roster is deeper than last season's team? And which young player do you think is most likely to become the biggest surprise this year? One more thing that keeps standing out when you look at this roster is how much the philosophy of the front office has changed compared to just a few years ago. The Lions are no longer trying to patch holes with temporary fixes. They are trying to create waves of talent so that when one player leaves, the next one is already prepared to step in. That is exactly why someone like Kendrick Law matters more than people realize. Fans often look at a rookie wide receiver and ask, can he help right now? But sometimes the better question is, who is he replacing next year? Because when you look at Greg Dortch, for example, if he has a strong season and his value rises, Detroit may not want to pay that next contract. That is where planning ahead becomes critical. Instead of scrambling in free agency, the Lions want the replacement already in the building, already learning the system, already trusted by the coaching staff. That is how sustainable contenders stay contenders. It is not just about star players, it is about timing. The same applies at linebacker. Malcolm Rodriguez has been a fan favorite because of the way he plays and the way he carries himself, but NFL decisions are rarely emotional. They are practical. If Jimmy Rolder gives you similar production with more athletic upside and years of rookie contract control, that becomes a real discussion. That is why training camp this year could be more competitive than people expect. Some of these depth names are not just fighting for backup roles, they are fighting to become the next version of a starter this team may eventually